Okay, yeah. Lasso. Yeah. Tiring asu kita. Tinder join korla. Tadi. Kali senada. Better tahu senada. Tadi lobjong ciare nyamda. Tinder join korla. Ngatu nyamda lobjong ciare senada.
So today is a group class together to learn about those 12 links of dependent origination.
Tambo de Karijini Tinder Johnny Sapapo lawyer, Dig Corla, Lojontia, some long Korean, but the Nagakoma Song Sikiranso. Tiranso Karijin in Dig or Lojontia and Dobayoring Hakoma Songs.
Khenpo is not sure why you were interested in having this particular topic of the Wheel of Existence, the 12 links. He's not sure why you were interested. But it's a very important one. Because in fact it's really the root of all of the Buddha's teachings.
Perna tataranga zogon loyaga tinder nimbo ngakte mingla tinder nimbo lakuyores.
So the long mantra that Khenpo just recited is the heart essence of dependent origination.
Ta te tinder nimbo teang yinya dela ming jamba chiyores dela.
It also has another name. The natural clarity of the Dharmakaya.
Perna Paturumbuchegi, Kankin Longchen Ramjunki Song, Tamzudun de Sola, Churku Ransel, Songa, Denis, Toba Jariores, Betena, Namjin, Tinder Himbola, Churku Ransel.
Because Patrul Rinpoche commentated and praised often Longchenpa's, Longchen Rabjam's 7 treasuries, and praised them as the innate or natural clarity of the Dharmakaya, which is why this is given that name as well.
Tini Tati Tinder Siri Tsikde Ji Lam Dripo Sunguni Nampasan Tipa Tadrop Kutsawandraoti Tindrila to Yores.
So this word dependent origination, again it's like the root. All of the Buddha's teachings can be summed up as the foundation, the path, and the fruition, and the very root of all of that is dependent origination.
Chetang Ronsum Panchita Tanganjir Ningmaga Tambala Zachiu de Ronsum Padang Longchen Ramjum Nigayorva Di Nani But Ronsum Pada Sonkananda or Interkormabo Son Yores.
They are considered 2 great panditas of the Nyingma tradition. One is Longchen Rabjam and one is Rongzompa. And Rongzompa also, many of his teachings are about dependent origination.
Ronsum ki song mambo nang jigde tekchin surjuk la yore tekpa chimbu surlan jukpa jongsi yorwa injina jiremi besi
chungju da bugitsig
tekchin sena mahayana sur sena tap tang tawala ko yore jukpa sena ngato man jukpa te tingari.
So of Rongzom's many teachings, one is titled Entering the Manner, Entering the Way of the Mahayana.
Di nang la kongki nyan tu dang, rang sang ji dang, jangju sen pa dang, sang yi chang ma de, din zhi ke lam tok pa la din zhong re, song ni chang ma, din zhi rang, ke tong ni kong ye wa qin zhuo re.
And in this teaching he says that whether it's a Shravaka, a realization or a pratyeka Buddha who is realized, or a bodhisattva, or a fully enlightened Buddha, all of them, what they have realized is dependent origination. So just the word dependent origination in Tibetan is tendrel. So much could be said about the word alone. So for one example, Tsongkhapa, one of his great praises of the Buddha is called In Praise of Dependent Origination. And he titled it that because Shakyamuni Buddha was, he praised him for being the one who realized that, the one who spoke of dependent origination, the one whose meaning he had the greatest mastery in the world of. And if we look at the teachings of Nagarjuna, even more we come across this term of dependent origination. So one of the Buddha's great Mahayana sutras is called the Rice Seedling Sutra. You can find the English translation. And the whole theme of this sutra is dependent origination. And then Nagarjuna went on to compose a word-for-word extensive commentary on that sutra. So really, in the view of dependent origination, there is no wisdom, no correct view that isn't included or subsumed in that. Rongzongpa, again, in his praise of dependent origination of the Buddha, he was saying that, the view of dependent origination is the door to all realization. And it's the supreme realization of dependent origination is enlightenment. And in Nagarjuna's root verses of the Middle Way, he says there is no phenomena that does not arise dependently, does not originate dependently, and therefore there is no phenomena that is not emptiness. And when we come to understand and really appreciate dependent origination, that was the Buddha's great awakening, it becomes a very authentic, inborn kind of faith, a deep, authentic interest we feel in learning about it. However,
Kensa, Minda, Gingonda, Devotional, Mambosin, the Kari and Asani, they Hakoya Zamchina, they younger soldiers go on the two size.
So, however, if our interest is just to understand this painting that we see on many temple entrances, to try and understand what all the different parts of the images of the old man and this and that, just to try and explain the painting is a narrow interest in the topic. It is still, of course, an introduction of the meaning of dependent origination. And so in understanding dependent origination, there's the relative understanding and the ultimate understanding.
Kunzu demba gafs kwalin du karisam jikting kon khowa ta di ju yin shon chongram dang de go ni de ke japo yore di gafs te de la ta de yores ta da modi na ken ro ya chop yores kunzu demba chop bin de.
And so a relative understanding of dependent origination is understanding the causes and the conditioning of how, the world turns, of how everything happens in this world.
Ta tondam demba sewa te ko nilure te karesba chutanti tender yanzang toni yambare sevi gombolo to sonta te la sangbo tanto yores.
And then the ultimate understanding of dependent origination is understanding the way that things truly are, and understanding that everything is originating interdependently, and therefore there's nothing that is not emptiness by nature.
So
Khenpo asked for a minute for him to divert onto another topic for. And so Khenpo requested, because this is such a wonderful place for teaching. Khenpo's come a long way. It's such a wonderful opportunity. Can he have 3 hours for the teaching?
Yeah. Na yamba kanga mari yana ta ko girgin chin na gin chin na chu nyam de tom jong jik ji di chang chola din de de jang ta bi na ni na lo de wo chong de ni na zo ka cha ma de phe tham ya bu.
Because like a teacher, like a good teacher, he wants all of us to really learn and engage. Then it makes it a much better teaching overall. He's able to say more clearly.
Yenda yang stela mang chachin chi yores te kare ni se na padro bo chi gonzala mi ka lo na la so na kere ko no ko chuse wa de be ka chi bores ko no se wa de ni 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 khoran kare yenda yang ta ka ta khoran ya ya de be na ka chi bo shi re sha na ga za zo chi ni yin yin sam yin ti sam lo de yo gores.
However, there's a very important condition behind all of this, and that's, of course, our intention and our conduct. And we want to have a really direct, strong intention for learning this teaching. And then the conduct would be, try not to fall asleep, keeping the mind attentive, and not being completely distracted on something else. That shows respect for the nature. But he likes the kind of Western way of being relaxed. So if you need to go to the loo, just put up your hand. Don't need to feel too worried about going if you need to.
Samba Junction chok the sink passes, and in the Lojong Jin, Chunyam Lin Jin, and the Jin, Muni Namba Rangayana, the Takata Tangi compound top, Ross and Jana Panto, but Yoma Saga, then you go along to Yango Yaris.
And then furthermore, if one is able to have that bodhicitta intention, that deep intention for enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, that this teaching, this learning can really lead to that.
딱 딘디更long当 집에 거는 냐야라 강하기 냐야가 데랭기 낭돈데 짜침보 임바데 샘부다네 물린다고 지제고 요래서라 때 가신 버렸어 제장은 가르치지 딘데르세와데 짜침보르세 나야 임천데 인스.
So our attitude towards the teaching is really important, and because it is such a very sacred teaching, our attitude towards it will make a great difference in our experience.
지와 된다 연나 저랑서 인지민 집이 네 강랑이 고구는 도대 들어와 요삼나 대체 가서 들어와 뒤쪽대라 딱딱딱 들어와도 나로치.
And if you're not clear at any time, if you have a question about what Khenpo said, please feel free to ask at any time.
아니 니 레와라 드링 아주 좋은데 돈든 덴바고 한테 당운더니 딘들 거대 망정시 산 건설 덴바고 한테 히바데.
Okay, so Khenpo's intention is for today us to learn the ultimate understanding of dependent origination, and tomorrow to look at the relative understanding. Is that all right with you?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. 때 자신들 돈당 덴바그 딘들스나 저당 삼삼라 조선 때에나 딘들리 리바 아크요레 딘들 나부이가 그래서 딘들 라비오디 파츠 추니 찍찍라 뚜요바 이니 찍요와 다 Dzogchen 토산이 갑도가 했나 가라 뚜바 매바 찍고 고아도 당도 스크레스 옛날 니니 발랑 갈와요 말이스 그 두바는 타투들라 랩차디 두미케다나 랩도요레 그 두지 거라 메조리와 동네 박착 공비는 우부 박착 공저야 제아메지 공비는 대양신이 공원저서 시와라 대송요 다들 특히 가르다 좀 경험담보 동반이 삼미 곰나 니 남직나 대야 고질라만도나 니 동반이 냠빌로데 안 내가 체크했어 간서는 동반이 냠빌로데 동반 말이 냠빌로데다 두디어라 동반 많이 빠지면은 막 동반에는 동반이 이거 말해 니 남직 거라지가 오토매틱 젠이 내버려 다들 간거요 말해
So I'm going to continue to use the word shunyata for emptiness. And sometimes in like Dzogchen, for example, we'll hear a term like the realization that goes beyond dependent origination. And because in that context, one is beyond any point of reference. There's no is for an is not, and is not for an is, and so on. So Aryadeva has a line in his verse that says, with the great realization, even emptiness, which one has realized, there is no emptiness. There is no non-emptiness, so beyond all point of reference. But it doesn't mean that there's a contradiction between the two. It's really one of language.
배나 Dzogchen 배나 우보 자랑 대다오시 그 요인데 딘들 많이 받지 자소는 아니 지금 딱딱바로 착로로 근데 차요 그 방와 지습도 그 딘들 장에 나지는 방와 그런 매받자니 딘들랑 만들 그 가사 참만 매받 착소는 되니 딘들 만들고 딘들 생각 보고요 내가 자가시
So the phone, as Khenpo is holding it, so
Koran 요인데 아주미라 코탕 인도 그 딘들 많이 받지 그 토란로야 똑같이 몰라요 말이세요. 오케이.
So as long as we perceive anything, for example, we perceive this phone, although it might be a phone only by dependent origination, as long as we perceive this phone even as that, it is dependently arising. But when one kind of sees through that, goes beyond, then even the dependent arising of the so-called phone that our mind is labeled, even that is not dependent arising. There's nothing to dependently arise.
저당기 네가 강한도와 뜻이가 게론타 생치도와 사진점도 또 쇼링 담보랑다요. 게론타 상지 좀 든디 게론 남라든지 민도인데 상지 좀 든디 게론 남라 말아. 그 겐담바 마부 지라 냠도 다 요산이더니 상지 좀 든 말에 나조레샤스 이건 도데.
So Khenpo is beginning to teach this rice seedling sutra, and it begins with, there were many bhikshus gathered with the Buddha. So we don't need the whole sutra, but the first part, the Buddha is saying, whoever sees dependent origination sees the Dharma. Whoever sees this sees the entire realization. So this is a passage that is in many of the earliest sutras. One who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma. So it really sees the Dharma, really awakens and sees the way things really are. And so in the ancient language of Buddhism, it's said that there are 10 different connotations or meanings of the term Dharma. But here it's Dharma like with a capital D, meaning the path to realization, and like nirvana.
Okay. So don't so good in the Tona, Sina,
So the Buddha says whoever sees dependent origination awakens to nirvana, sees nirvana.
And
the Buddha says, and whoever sees the Dharma sees the Buddha.
상지 좀 던지고 송배 까다잖지 요래 야대 소다 때 딱봐 칼라 요래 마하야나의 트래디션 때 송배 때 자신 보자 그랬어 돌지 좀 하나 찍찍 요래.
And this passage that one who sees this sees the Dharma, one who sees the Dharma sees the Buddha is a very famous line throughout Mahayana sutras, especially in the Diamond Cutter Sutra.
강박 나라 죽수통 강박 나라 다슈파 다시바 되는 로포로 슈파데 이우디는 나마통 소나 상지 줬는데 수직게 되다 증년다 자당 대초나 상지리 삼등 건지 요나 디그 상지 통고요 말에 상지 줬는데 늘지 접이 나는 짓때가 손으로.
And so the Buddha says in the Diamond Cutter Sutra that the one who sees the form of the Buddha or hears the vibrations or the sounds of the Buddha and think it is the actual Buddha has missed the mark.
어느 가래에서는 렘바 남도 추지고 손이 근데 추고데 상지군이데 상지 추지고래 손.
So what is the Buddha then? The Buddha, the truth there is the Dharmakaya.
이 추지고데 가래에서는 아주 생각이 오사와 동반이 때 생각이 때 추지고래.
And what is the Dharmakaya? It is that very nature of our own consciousness, which is that clarity, that luminous awareness, shunyata. So from an ultimate perspective, dependent origination is shunyata. So when we hear that you see dependent origination, you see the Dharma, you actually see the Buddha, and we see that painting of the wheel and we think, oh, I've seen the actual Buddha. Again, that's sort of missing. It's not quite the idea. to really understand, it's a much more complex, deep, holistic picture that we need to get. However, these tankas and images, of course, they're symbols that help, that point to that very profound, transcendent nature.
Tanka la danis, be,这等那时候扎清不来的，你这念，kabarana念经通松，念的，伢那啦密西给了哇，过忙不休就加下，这样是用嘛的，没给吧些，过忙不加下。Tanka mo me satang ko mo bo jak na jing dong. So of course okay, so Khenpo's setting up a bit of a story. So of course these tankas, these images are very sacred. Khenpo heard of an individual in China who was destroying many images, breaking them, burning them. 아니 메디가 뭐 망보라 딘디 리시 잡니 콘소 딘 덴바렌트 삼니 콘소 나라 용니 그다 야미게 소진테소라 아미토폰다 오다 아미타바다 챤리즈 마고 요러와 계속 짝짝짝 미치게 짝 야바데 저기야 리그레스니 그런 문탄지에 콘소 그데서 또리야
Yeah, so there was a, of course in China they have Amitabha statues and Avalokiteshvara and many, and he was destroying them, and then the surrounding people said, continue to do it, that's good, continue to destroy them.
And
why the people actually agreed with him doing that was because he gave them an explanation that as soon as we see an image of a Buddha, immediately we feel some kind of hope, some expectation, and we need to cut through that.
Muni Kashitana Yores, Ben Koranda, Koda Tindayona, Koreva Janima, Chubochaya, Solamandoya, Tidi Chedi, some Tidi Chet to Koshamia, Uni Yores, Ya, or Sama Yores.
So, of course, it's not uncommon when we have an idol, some image that we kind of make hope and prayers to become, our self grasping becomes stronger. We're hoping to get wealthy and whatnot.
Uni tombago koshamia miyuru uni te dang guba uni te maris.
But it's important to understand as a Buddhist that the reason for having any image is not for that at all.
Matsu tombago kosham gogore, chopa pigore, guba gogore te so gudi yudi sanji jomdo took the jingle yoris. They refer to yori connection, connected.
The reason as a Buddhist it's important to have the image of the Buddha, to have something like a shrine, to make offerings, to feel this devotion, because it imprints, it connects our mind with the form, the symbol of the Buddha. And so with that attitude, it doesn't matter if you have 100 images of the Buddha. If it helps our wisdom and compassion to develop, then it's a good thing. And we hear in the great teachings of Patrul Rinpoche and of Maitreya and so on that, of course, we go to the three jewels for refuge, but the truest refuge is the Dharma. So why ultimately there isn't a need for any of this. Of course, it's very meaningful for us to have Buddha images and to have so many different teachings of the Dharma. They all have reason, they all have a purpose to help us understand that which is...
태어나야 다든지 남는 되게는 맨날 시대 나 예수 주변 근데 된지 그 자리 그 건다 어떤 자야 가드 찍 맞고 말이 양바 참아대 야보 말이 남편 종요네 나는 무슨 돈이
네, 하고네.
이거래. 근데 가드스는 다사 찍고 말이지 양바 가서 자리 지나다고 고마고 야보 말이 남디 엄마 같이 방법 나봐이나 우리 덴바인 살에 삼는 공수 유기하는 거래. 근데 영상 가르에서는 소종 완전히 내 염선다고 하고 염선. 아니면 양바를 남상고 줄도 그러와.
Then Gadi said it?
Gadi 말다. 이제 제바보 사지요.
So God. Yeah, so in Taiwan there was this case of somebody destroying many idols, breaking them. And then there were some Buddhists, even Khenpo has heard of some Buddhists that thought, kind of heard the reasoning and thought, well, actually kind of makes sense. And then also felt to maybe destroy their own images of the Buddhas. But that came from a lack of a full, complete understanding of how they function in the Buddhist context.
Then, then John the song Jang Masung per Jopana, and the Tang do the Soma, Taiwan in a bay in Toyo. Carasicora, Jigma, John the David, only my young pen, John the Tambo, or Chuntoana, the Maritinjang, Sui, take a Chuntona, take a Sonji Toari, somewhere. Then it jam Masung per Sonji the Jew that in Jamba de Yang and George. And you share it for Lion from the Mahakana, and comes to the George and Jingo.
So these Mahayana sutras are really quite marvelous. So the setting is usually the Buddha would have given a profound, usually brief teaching, and then sometimes other attendants, like in this case it's Shariputra and Maitreya. And in this case the Buddha just says, if you see this Dharma, you see the Buddha. That's all he says. And then through the power of the Buddha's blessing, Shariputra then asks Maitreya to explain that. And the sutra is Maitreya explaining it. And so usually the teaching is quite simple and profound, and it's only after somebody asks questions that then the teachings start to become more detailed. And so the first question that Shariputra asks is, what is the meaning of tendril, of dependent origination? Okay, sorry, so Maitreya asked Shariputra this question. So the question is, what is dependent origination? And the Buddha then went in to explain these 12 links, starting with avidya, so ignorance, and then the formation and the consciousness and name and form and so on. So an important note here is that the dependent origination teaching in the context of like Theravadan teachings, so for the Shravakayana, the Pratyeka Buddha, those early Nikaya, we see the sutra, but it's not equating it fully with shunyata. So they're understanding how everything is dependent arising. And so it's a reflection, in Theravada it's a reflection on the selflessness of the person and on dependent origination, but not on shunyata.
옛날에 동반이니까 단위 공소가 나라 매발에 위해서는 되게 견이 말이 영대야 하고 그래.
But it doesn't mean that Theravada doesn't teach shunyata. That doesn't mean that.
옛날에 군비 값을 공소가 좀그 시험이고 검다 때니 되니 이 띵들 그 상통 그 따와대 정신이 줄라지기 그랬어.
But the approach in Theravada tends to be one of, the meditation from shamatha and vipassana, and through the union of the vipassana, then it naturally, the insight is naturally born through meditation.
나 당 디그 시험이 vipassana 당그 공부 냠용은 약보용은 디디 당 냠的 같이 현용스.
The Khenpo's had some good conversations with very accomplished vipassana meditators.
공소가 그래라 건설들이 시험이 공미야랑 지들이 칼에 저니 주부 들차 용수 쪽바디 파 남과 니마가 세고 들는 긴 거라 잡고요 봐 배신다 차와도 좀 통근득스 소근득스 다 소근득스
So sometimes
니마 해야지 들차모모 님이나 로요아 어때나 그래서 로바가 니마 해야지 필라모 지들이 차려다
kodila yer me ba do.
Tati nang jinji, zubu te chazang de dok do dang chakpo do mai ba, ko dul nang jinji chakpo do ba do, ta churki do ya.
So for a vipassana meditator, advanced meditator, they can have a very direct experience of the seemingly substantial body becoming completely like insubstantial. So much like when we look at the sun, especially at a high level, like a high altitude sun, there's a lot of kind of small little particles or moving little tiggly type around the sun. That's the way that they directly experience the true nature of the body.
That 값을 띠게 zupu고 치고 들사고 들미고 들타모 정말 되게 차오데 그줄 잡고 요랬어. 차와때 조양 생고 소리 요랬어. 공소 그줄 잡고 요랬어. 옛날에 찍 장바 찍더니 랑축다 봐요 말했어. 찍라 찍대 봐. 그래 식도 요반도 양 요반도 매반도 근데 힘도 참 요와시고 나가라더니 정말 니디요. 요와.
And they can have an incredibly direct, not sensory, but incredibly direct experience of the extremely subtle, subatomic, very particle level, that vibratory nature, that it's not existing, but somehow, just this, hard to explain, but extremely subtle level.
때 삼로당이 용조 말했어. 너니 공부도 지랑신 그들이 좀 소용이 그래서
And it's direct. It's not something they're thinking or reflecting cognitively on. It's a direct experience.
배나 맞죠 나와봐기 전에 나와 차위 머딱봐 머딱봐 그 자신 뭐라 락비 머딱봐 차위 머딱봐 니어로 차와위 머딱봐 차와까지 기 머딱봐
So this is like a very subtle momentary impermanence. In Buddhist language, there's coarse impermanence and subtle impermanence. This is a very subtle.
다 땡들 얘들 공소문이 그 소소소소 랑사나 리카치기 요래 이나 리카치긴 찍찍까지 지금 똑똑찍 컨트롤 찍긴지 존진 찍긴지 요래 무슨 대요 말
도trengenane
도tren데서 파서 지금 리카치기 요다 이나 리카치기 좀 보스 요래 요 말이야 대라 판선 찍라 찍 땡장들
And their description of the experience is that, they can feel this very active, vibrant kind of nature, but it's not like there's a center to it anywhere. There's no source of the functioning. Everything is dependently originating. It's very hard to put your finger on.
그런 게 담당자지 그런 쪽으로 보스를 가지고 있는데 예시주를 꼭 건조를 받아들 지고 대만이 요마를 딱대 쪼대 줄 양바다 남바를 띵들 만다서 쪼찍대 있어.
And it's really a description of like this dependent origination experience that it's a way of, it's a nature, a way of being. We can't say it's non-existing. If something arises, there's a dependent origination of something that isn't arising, there's nothing else arising sort of thing. There's no order to it, there's no point of reference.
그걸 차와도 찬지거로 와. 네 코란들이 저도 코란 요. 깨와 각반이가 뒤쪽에 가서 제기하래 속여래. 깨와 각반이가 뒤쪽에 가서 제기. 뒤쪽에 완전.
So these very subtle particles, like in one moment, they're both arising and ceasing.
현니 고알이야 갖고 요래지 저랑 고추 요나데 약보래지 땡들서야 될 나오면 맞은 소스です
It's hard to get our minds around if we're confused. It's a good sign.
니 약보 마셔봐 말이지 땡들 갖고 요
It's not it's not because Khenpo's not explaining it well, it's because it's very hard to understand.
지금 나 막겨봐 말이지 세상 종是기위 당연히 대능이 버는 갖추진세 다다 버추지다 봐 여러분 아달마 그티 추지다 그 송가 나와 기와 코랑 각바리 송 대송요래 마토고 기위 지랑 가가요나 기와 까지마데 기 망가다 각도까지마데 기와 매버 탄교 되는 고모들 그때 연잡여로 Kewa dan kapanya dicicik mana kanner cik resena. Kewa mubote nggak neberta. Ku di koran gitu sen kapal geri cik.
So these great Buddhist philosophers like Dharmakirti and in very concise language. I mean, it's a bit like a paradox. It completely kind of blows the mind. So arising and cessation are somehow neither one or the other, but also both. So in its arising, it's not ceasing, but it's the kewa.
Kewa te bangkapanya dicicik dewesin one moment or no one moment.
Is arising and cessation, is it in the same moment or not?
Please.
Is arising and cessation in the same moment?
Answer.
After the other. Rises first and then ceases
second.
Second.
No. This your first seat, second seat, you're different people, your person, yeah? So it's a different thing. Same like that. Jewa is no Gapa is not Jewa. So it's Jewa Gapa, what English?
So like what arose, when it's ceasing, it's not there anymore?
Okay. Jewa is muboji yorwes.
So is there anything that arises?
Yorwes. Yes, of course. Jewa. Yeah, okay, yeah. Then Jewa Koran Gapa yorwes. Jewa Koran Gapa eres.
So the thing, the actual thing that arose, does that cease?
Yes or no? Not wrong. Just you said yes or no.
It arises, it stays for a little while, and then it ceases.
There's a negiri, then it got to do.
Mari, Jewa Koran yubi dichola. Koran Gapa eres.
Nobu Koran ki kiwi ki tutsula. So in the moment that a thing arises, is it cessation there?
This is difficult.
Yeah.
Jewa lang Gapa yo, somebody got to kill him. Yes. Yeah. Give me the. Countarian.
So is arising impermanent or not?
Yes or no?
It's transient, yes. It comes and goes.
Yeah, cái tiếng hát câu quan cái là có dùng cái đấy chứ, chỉ là không có chỉ chỉ là mất tập. Hiện nay ya, tawa cái số tí cái sẽ ngồi lên check mà hết.
So what you're saying, conventionally it all makes sense, but when the Madhyamaka analysis is in discussion, it doesn't make any sense.
Không phải là cái khuôn cái samsul tam
because it only makes sense in the way we think of it. Because everything So in the Dharmakirti, for example, in these Madhyamaka analyses, everything that arises in the second moment is not there.
Second moment is not your time. Second moment is also chorang ke tichu mare is. Chorang tichu your time. Chorang te tirum nyuk pare. Chorang tirum nyuk taksik pare is. Te na is.
Because it's not its time anymore. For example, the 20th century arose, but by the 21st century, it's not the 20th century anymore.
Yeah. Ko ngupu chik de chorang la yo pi chachu de chorang ka yo gore. Chorang ka lakpa de chorang la nyam de yore. Derma. Chorang marki go hun la chorang ka lakpa yo marwa.
Because the thing in its arising, prior to its arising, was not there. So our arm, for example, it's a part of our assemblage as we've arisen, but it wasn't there before we arose. So this is what we need to think about when we're establishing the correct view of reality.
Kati chorang te chokla samlo martang marik pikin jindabchi chongre se marik pali li chongre se ti koram te hakwa chamji sanji dore lamna ka ando marwa.
As if we don't really look into this, and then we hear about the 12 links, like based on ignorance comes the samskara, and then there's the consciousness and there's the karma. We'll think of them substantially, and we'll never get it realized. So it does have a conventional explanation in a way like history. It explains how things have arisen, but it's almost like giving us a background or. But if one is meditating with the aim of becoming an arhat to destroy the klesha, one does that by this direct insight into the subtle impermanence. So many of you have studied Mipam Rinpoche's Madhyamaka, middle way.
Yeah.
The torch of wisdom, is it? The lamp of wisdom, or?
Yeah. Yeah. There's the other one. Other Nishi Domesi, Nishi.
Oh, Nishi Dome, okay.
Domesi na. Yeah. Nishi Domesi, Omag Yongsi Yores.
Yeah, so there's Mipam Rinpoche has this teaching, the torch of certainty.
Yeah, commentary of Omanjuba, De Yore, Omanjuba, thereby Yore, Demba. They Tama Nana Karisong Yoresina, Nyantu da Ransaji Namki, Chuji Dagme, Zopato Yomaris. That Tomba ni Chatanto Yomaris. Yanaya, Teni, that is Chavi Matapa, Tommy, Kansaka Dagme, Tommy, Dacham Tops of Yoris.
And in the Torch of Certainty, there's also some commentary on the middle way. And these commentaries are all saying that the Pratyeka Buddhas and the Shavakayana, so the kind of Hinayana realization is not the complete realization of Shunyata. They attain Arhat by their direct realization of the subtle impermanence, which is the realization of the selflessness of the person.
니시단처 맞딱바 성교요래. 저랑서 딱바데 랍교요. 따와가다가 착자지세와 지금 나와요. 착자지세로 인지가라고.
3 marks.
오케이. 착자지, 착자 섬이가 요래 지야 요래 들려.
So we've heard about these 3 marks of existence that characterize all phenomena. According to Buddhism, sometimes there's 4, but generally 3.
디 나라 담보대가를 니지 탐처 맞딱바오 성교요래.
And the first is that all composite phenomena are impermanent.
디 맞딱바다 상지점던 그 송가만 그 짜친 거 지금 성교요래. 디 상로대.
So this insight that all conditioned phenomena are impermanent is considered a very profound insight of the Buddha.
가르때 니기 탐처 맞딱바세와데 오 다다 얼마 참아 로자 탐도 지라요 말에 세안다고데 상년가리 하고 말에 가서 지키는 님한테 싫어를 대라고요 말이야. 내가 좀 저번에 님 참아 하고 요랬어.
Because this great insight of the Buddha, it's not come by easy. Like we all know we're going to age. We all know people don't live beyond 100. Like it's not uncommon knowledge. But what the Buddha's insight was quite special.
这玩意那个真的，因为我不可能，刚结完我不觉得话，可能改白吧，结经比较是可能改白吧，但你个娘的有把的可能大辈子去不了。
So the insight there is that a thing in its arising is ceasing. It's
但对的，别人啊，那做个引这个呢，分析。即是程度啊，看你程度啊，做嘞，做他查证的，查清白的，查生死啊，就个吧。其他个国外联邦的，他因为只是讲各方用过的，所以那个各查的是讲了的，检查就第一个，你个的讲把上我把下个有的。
So you know the word finish, we can talk about will finish, finishing, as finished. And when we think of cessation, we're thinking conventionally like that about it. So does it come to our mind when we think of a thing in its arising, in its very rising, is its very ceasing? Does that make sense?
제가 가르 때라 공부를 두고 때라 리파 마부 휴지 땅에 때라 짐선 마부 휴지예요. 근데 만나 좀 가려요랬어야 돼. 공부를 두고 마부 쓰는 거. 마디마카나.
So if we look at Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka, he's challenged the intellect really to its exhaustion by uncovering all of the logical flaws if something is, if something is not, and so on.
때 가르에서는 이위 우보 고랑 그 가수 각바 세와데 좀 냈나 야만 각바 우미 착 각바 우미 있는 제와 우보리 니가 냠도 동도 착삭 말와
Yeah, so it's a bit like a paradox because in a thing, if in a thing's arising, in its arising, if the thing's cessation is not in that very moment, then in a second or later moment, its cessation, the thing wouldn't be there.
슈탐천 맞딱바 라디가 배나가서 맞딱바서 왔다 맞딱 동무 똥 당네 세니 맞딱바데 니시 코랑 그 자주지 맞딱 니시 마고바나 맞딱바 창 마고바 니마제 고 맞딱바 창로 이세로 되니까 상말에 니시 주 코랑 맞딱바.
So these 3 marks of existence, so it's impermanence, suffering, dukkha, and selflessness. All phenomena are characterized by those 3 marks. And when we hear about impermanence, it's not that, at one point in the future it will pass away. It's in its very moment. It is impermanent.
세상 대 갈래 있거나 되니 나동 소죽 세와대야 고용해 그래와 이래.
And when we really, really analyze fully, we get this insight, which is the union of appearance and emptiness.
나가 자올라마 지거는 캄보 추첩 certain Khenpo chuchapse nga lama jingore bhaila be lama zachi bores.
And so,
Khenpo chuchap.
So Khenpo's Tsawe Lama, his root teacher, one of them was from Serta Khenpo Chuchap.
Kongi oma kormabu sore na oma mabu deni jang.
And Khenpo learned much of the Madhyamaka teachings from this Khenpo.
Kongo sonde chorangi ti oma di yakpuji tokna Dzogchen chenpo de lilau tok kreso.
And he said if you really understand Madhyamaka, Dzogchen becomes quite easy.
第一个空了没开始个，俺拉做法全部送了去，过去了，就空个，你我俺写个有，那东送就写个有，就让对嘛，对个判那头呢，对你俺拉刚写也没事，你嘛赶紧打。
So this Lama, so many people would go to this Lama and ask for Dzogchen teachings, and he would say, I teach Madhyamaka, I teach the middle way, I teach the union of appearance and emptiness. If you don't want those teachings, just go away.
这样。 nang tong song juk de kong ni de song kare kut pa ro kut pa kar bo chik dang nak bo chik nyam de di chi japan ro la song juk la re ma yes nang pa khorang tong ba khorang nang ba yin ba chik nyama chik la chorang go sam lu nang khor tham na de ka so amang go chu.
When we hear the union of appearance and emptiness, it's not a union like if we have a black thread and a white thread and we unite them. It's not a union like that, but rather appearance is emptiness. Emptiness is appearance. And when our mind can really open to that insight, then we get the union that the word means. And it's difficult. Sometimes we get an actual headache trying to understand it.
Yeah. 참참만 은행에 저랑 그 냠냠 그 땅에 떼자 고추나 zupo 참마 파체 실도요 반다 여여한다 매매한다 캔사 지거든 라비나 마도 마쇼니까 그 용서 그래. 레바나 마쇼니까 그 용서 그래.
And if we and sometimes if one reflects on it an awful lot, you can have an experience of this sort of very impermanent, subtle nature of your being that the experience of the kind of where your mind is going, it doesn't fit in your brain. It can be very challenging.
대소 원래 가서 때다 곰다 동반이 걸라 땅 차위 맞다 발라 상로 땅 윈지를 나서 그 초라 촌이 매바데 약고가 딱 말이었어요. 촌이 초란 타니라 랩도 매비다. 나서 남긴 초라 매바 현낭 매바 동반이래서 인차사 된다 가지고 내가 저 등은이 고아데 샘그 타니라 랩도 매비다. 들이 현낭다 지금 용나 이 가서 저랑 그때 냠는 때다 타니라 이랬다.
So it's this is an understanding that really comes through meditation, reflection, and we hear about there's no eye, no ear. We hear things do not exist over and over again, and when this kind of very challenging experience arises through trying to understand, it's a good sign that maybe that kind of non-verbal or more non-dual nature of the understanding is coming closer. And the Buddha actually says this in the Diamond Cutter Sutra. So in the Diamond Cutter Sutra, the Buddha says when one hears of emptiness, of shunyata, if you don't feel fear and anxiety and this kind of challenge, then very likely for many thousands, for many eons, you've been making offerings to the three jewels and created an enormous amount of merit, because for most people, it's very challenging to the ordinary mind. It can bring up a lot of fear.
Tenda yenzang, ani semke tangla tenda yongtu, ta ti kapsa karichi goresana, tela nga tsogo nyamne ke kapsa, kek tang korsa, kek tang korsa, ta kek ser kondon ziwa jiwa gomsa tabdi.
Choka sumna.
Kek, ta parche jawa, kek. 그 객의 내용이 객의 세월지 야부지구나 되니 라마가 망약당 라마라 소르와 대비하다 아니 데리지나 되니 되게 나베 매버지니 야부지로.
So what to do when this happens, when this fear arises, and we can consider it a block. It's like a barrier, and we want to, dissolve this barrier. So we request the Lama for pith instructions. We feel a lot of devotion and offer our devotion and offerings to the root teacher.
그래서 나 초랑기 머딱 봐도 동반이 때 땡사부 소리용디 샘거 동안에 지히나 나초 빼 가슈고 파이어 사자 강바니 타나 주포 참아 사실 제가 몇 번도 찾아와요. 지금 초라 용거 같다. 티값이 시기로 왔다. 루토고 말아. 다시 초라 남아도 용거 있어.
Yeah, and it's very, it's very natural that we would feel fear because we identify, with our country, with our families, with our house, with our place, not to mention our own body, how much we identify. So for that, in such a subtle experience of impermanence or shunyata, for that to, fall apart can be very distressing. So what Khenpo advised can really help to soothe and ease us through that kind of fear. We can say fire, heat, fire, fire, fire many times, but it doesn't burn us. But that one experience by touching the fire can.
So we can
talk about shunyata and impermanence on and on and on, but it doesn't necessarily have an effect.
So we can So the actual practice is always what really counts. In Tibetan they always say Ningje, which means compassion, take care. They say it all the time, but if somebody asks for your iPhone, that's the test if you really have the compassion or not. Yeah.
So, we can all generally understand about impermanence. We talk about it and explain it conventionally, but today we understand that even arising is impermanent. Yeah, so the lamas that Khenpo grew up So the previous generations of Tibetan lamas had very deep insights. Have you heard of Khenpo Kumpel?
Yes, okay. Khenpo Kumpel ku chunjukun rirbaga hiribleagun rirbaga nangla discourse yaposong yo.
So Khenpo Kumpel gave a commentary on the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, and he gave a commentary on the chapter on wisdom, which covers this a lot. There should be a translation somewhere that we can find.
The om jibdal jukde dang hibin go di pala tongcha yore marisini any himjukji.
So there'll be an exercise where you have the three syllables om ahom, and you imagine that they're printed one after the other on those three lotus petals in order. So as we're reciting the om and then the ah, so between the end of the om and the beginning of the ah, is there a gap or not?
Om sewa de chashi matapa kajik chikr kajik chikr om sewa de dokdok chik rewes yena li om a uji chik yena a de chok chik yor tak a de sam chak so dokdok sam chak.
And the syllable om that we recite is that one thing? Or does it have many pieces to it? Many stages? Likewise with the is it covering the first and the latter parts as well as the center?
갈때 요 말에 아때 독독 찍으세나 아당 홍이기 발라 발내나 아대 홍창도 홍대 발창도 니가 사사 찍라요.
And so if we decide that, say, the syllable is so if we decide that the is one thing, the is a syllable, substantial, and that between the and the hung there's no gap, then it's illogical, because then the hung is also an likewise the is also the hung.
So
lots of little tricks that they put your mind through. When Khenpo was learning this as a younger monk, it was very difficult. And so we can't cover, all of the teaching like this today, but if it opens a door and we see how we need to be pondering this, everybody's very clever, you can find the right text and you can on your own continue to get the insight. So we can also just recall this example of the and the hung, for example. So, if they're not substantially existing, then, they're dependently originating, but it's a relationship that is not of non-existence as well. And so this topic of dependent origination, then Tsongkhapa praised the Buddha as a praise of dependent origination. There's a bit of a background to why he did that. So Tsongkhapa, Tsongkhapa, he studied so much of the middle way teachings, the Madhyamaka teachings, and really struggled. In the beginning, he studied Nagarjuna's root verses of the middle way and had a lot of trouble understanding it. And so Tsongkhapa at the time would have had thousands of disciples, so he sent them all away and he took just 8 disciples and they went to a hermitage, and he did a lot of mandala offerings and accumulating merit, the type of things that we do in our preliminary practices. And he did that for many, many months. A lot of prostrations. And then one day he again looked at the root verses of the middle way. And then he got to chapter 18, which is the view of shunyata, which is the view of dependent origination, and his mind really kind of broke open to it. And then he felt a greater faith for the Buddha than he'd ever felt before, appreciating that this is what he had taught. And that's why he wrote this verses in praise of dependent origination, as a praise of the Buddha.
the Nyame Taborum Bochiga Parlayan Drone, Lord Gitin Rawich Yores, the Lord Gita here and any other Narso Japs. Drone the here and break time.
So, yeah. So generally, in all of the Buddhist teachings, we kind of come to this sort of edge. And when we look at the life of Milarepa and his relationship to Gampopa, there's some stories that illustrate it as well. So Khenpo will tell us a story, the Jila, then we'll have a break.
Yeah. 다 참아 기기나 하고 그래서 냠에 딱보름 붙이 때 지금 내가 주전 말라리 바가 로마 좀 이기는 찍게 봐. 대대 주전 말라리 바가 좀 추슈는 딱고 파공 그렇게 파이다 바로 배워야 파이에 나면 같이 사자 잠발라 배워야 잘기 잘해서 디값 공부 가르치르스나 다니 마공바나 니 로마 공부 잡다 로마 잡 근데 제시로 와 그래서 같이 찍고 그래서 좀 좋아지겠어.
And so Milarepa had, two principal disciples, and Gampopa was one of them. And after receiving many teachings, then the idea was to go off to your own place and to cultivate the teachings. But Gampopa also felt that he needed to kungi lomba tamchela tapchiche guri.
Ni lomba ni maopanam lomba lamara chushaya digora dititsu te katini he chokolese.
I see. And Gampopa was then asking Milarepa, when will it be the right time for him to teach his own students this in the future?
And Malari Picari Songasena, Nyamachikla, Kurang, Simjumo, Simkin, Nilu, Juma Mayimbate, Tartan, Lakachik, Saboching Tongaris. The Kapsus, Targim Malaya, Sangi Muyimbahaburi, the Kapsuranga.
And Milarepa's answer was one day when it's a very spontaneous, very authentic, clear experience that comes from the depths of your mind-heart. There'll be no question, and then you'll see Milarepa, his teacher, as the Buddha, and then you'll know that the time is right.
Interdependent talk the Sangila Tapatia, Conk simply looked at Tony, Maladipala, Tabahapotia, Nigati, Rotang Chibaris.
And so when Gampopa then felt even more extraordinary devotion to Milarepa after realizing this, it's the same as Tsongkhapa getting more devotion to the Buddha after realizing dependent origination.
Ngokor pecho chede mayim baruni nyamlen yung uni nyamlen konrotang ha kongkinchigina ko rangajin den derwachi yore.
And in Vajrayana, the idea of the root teacher being so sacred, it's not just to have a teacher who can tell you what to do. It's because the very nature of realization that happens through, receiving the pointing out through one's own cultivation, there's this very profound relationship by which it occurs.
Kareri sena simple niluti tatandi kapse tendrite tondachi barwaga simple nilu naton sonju de nandra tenders nandra die montro sonayina malari bag tukjid na den chong ni sanji song sang malari bi tukdang korang semya ta yin changro do tuyi yin changro Tikaso susu simple nilula mishi kewa nanginji malari bagata tujeku yondan tatutela ichi chigwa. Ni tinga nyamyara yakidori.
Because reflecting and then gaining this insight into dependent origination or shunyata, this union of appearance and emptiness. In Tibetan terms we talk about a recognition of the true nature of mind, of the way things are. That it is this sort of union of interdependence, shunyata, and it happens, when that happens, it's like one's own mind and the mind of the Buddha are the same mind, it's the same way of being. And so when one experiences that directly, there's nothing to happen but for us to feel very deep confidence and kind of an unshakable faith and confidence in the source of that teaching.
제장 나초 딘들 세와데 고알랑데 오 답에나 차릭바데도 딱히 지용도 오 답디 띵가 코니 딘리 제샤스야지가 딘리 참 많이 말아 우니 셈그 땅이 되게 송죽된 제리더니 그런 셈다 남과 찍던 데세와 나오긴 제리 되니 차도 때라 냠내라 거래 대 많이 벌아 힘죽 제니 딘들 거 코니 제가 딘들이 찍찍해 자기는 다 당상 때한테 콘돔 당디스 나는 데다 하고 열어 되냐나 그거 하자.
And because the insight of a Buddhist understanding, it's not like, in science. Really good science can get a very direct understanding, see it clear and say, there it is, that's how it is. This sort of objective but that's not how it is in Buddhism. Rather, it's this direct kind of, non-dual experience of, the nature of one's own consciousness becomes mixed with the sky, mixed with space, mixed with the awareness of the Buddha. And it's a very different quality of knowledge than the type that you can just point to. This is why Khenpo thinks that the Tibetan traditional way of learning and practicing the Dharma was very good, going back like 1,000 years.
가르에서는 의미가 추구는 그 찬릭당 니룩당 마부직데 소소 생근념내랑 그 땅라 배쳐도 땅아 말도 반절서야당 야기당 제 배쳐당요 말스.
Because all of the knowledge and the understanding of the world that the Tibetans would gain, even the very empirical observation, it was all in the interests of cultivating the human mind. It wasn't about technological development and material gain. It was about the whole person.
연나 대양 장미 대야 보래 랍고 말 제장가 좀 반저그 지리 탑송 뽑아서 교리들이 라고요 봐. 점점이 오래했을 때 그러나서 다 런탕고 가까씩 따라요 봐. 나 주문이나 그러나서 가르치고 해야 되지.
I mean, it's not, black or white. Of course, these more objective ways of knowing are very important, and they do help make the world a better place in many ways. There's often the criticism that Tibetan people suffered from poverty and lack of development. But when it comes to Dharma, it's, there's a different way that we could consider as better.
Yes. Okay.
Namo